you look back to 2017, kind of the 2018, the ICO boom, and I think that was a really interesting proof of concept. But what was missing there, like clearly in hindsight, was clearly defined issuer obligations and investor rights. So I think the strategy on the security side is to really focus on those kind of jurisdictions, places where the technology behind Bitcoin can really help them upgrade their capital markets infrastructure and bridge the gap between issuers and investors.
Jesse, thank you so much for sitting down with us here. I think you guys right now are on the forefront of a very interesting meshing of worlds that are in crypto and traditional markets right now. For starters, why don't we just talk about what Bitfinex Securities is really trying to pioneer down here in El Salvador?
Yeah, so we are a security tokenization trading platform. So we do capital raises and we do secondary market trading. Our goal right now is to bring high quality investment products to investors all around the world and to bring issuers and investors together. And that's where we see the opportunity in El Salvador, is to bring global capital to here in El Salvador.
When it comes to, I guess, in the US, obviously very sophisticated capital markets in size. When you look outside of the US, it's interesting to see kind of, even in that market, with everything that happened with the ETFs in 2024, the acceleration of everything that's happening around the globe in jurisdictions where there might be more interest in really starting to get things done well. I mean, how have you kind of seen that change in 25?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So 2024 was definitely the year of the ETF, and I think if you look around the world globally at any jurisdiction outside the US, all regulators and policymakers, they really look to the US for guidance. So I think what happens in the US is really important for every jurisdiction around the world. So in 2024, it was giving institutional investors better access to Bitcoin. And I think 2025, the story is going to really be about sovereign Bitcoin adoption. Then tied up with that is digital asset frameworks, trading frameworks, and regulatory frameworks.
Yeah, what has been, I guess, the biggest piece to that and doing it well when you're talking about tokenizing things? What has kind of been the piece that maybe some other traditional market players miss from the crypto native side? Because you and I were just talking, it's kind of, depending on which direction you want to come from, the problems and the solutions look very different.
There's a lot to talk about there. I kind of look at it as pieces of a puzzle, and I think like looking back at it, the four big pieces of the puzzle are like, number one, the technology. Do you have technology where you can issue these tokens on? Do you have platforms like Bitfinex Securities where you can do capital raises and trading? Number two would be investable assets. Do you have things that people want to commit capital to? Number three would be regulatory oversight. That's been kind of the slowest to develop, right? We've been talking about security tokens since 2018, and that's probably the big reason why it's been a little bit slow from a crypto perspective, though very fast from a capital markets perspective to develop, is because of the lack of those regulatory frameworks. I think we've got those now, especially here in El Salvador. So we've got three of those four boxes. I think the fourth one that's developing is on the investor side and distribution and bridging the gap with kind of mainstream investors with and explaining the benefits of tokenized securities.
Yeah, when it comes to those benefits, I feel like that's the interesting thing, even on non-traditional capital markets in the US, in terms of if you're big and you're successful, you can go that route.
Yeah.
And so maybe people look at the alternative fundraising opportunities and say, well, they must not be good because they could have gone the other route. I mean, when it comes to tokenizing things, what are you most excited about to offer people as, like you said, successful real projects now as they understand?
Yeah, I think there's two things there. Like if there's definitely like a size threshold within the US and with traditional markets. You need to be $150 million before investment banks are really going to take you seriously. But there's high quality issuers in a lot of places that don't have developed capital markets. So there's a real hunger for capital in a lot of different parts of the world outside of the mature markets, kind of like the G7 group. But I think within the bigger markets too, there's a really interesting opportunity for tokenized public equity. So, my background is in investment banking, working in ECM and capital markets. And in Asia, we do things like GDRs, right? Where you have a large public company in Asia. They want to get access to US or European investors. They do depository receipt issuances. I think tokenization can really fill that niche, right? Because you've got a lot of benefits. If you're a portfolio manager or a trader, like real-time settlement is a huge deal. 24/7, 365 trading is a huge deal. So Taiwan is down right now for Chinese New Year's, but we had news about tariffs in Taiwan and TSMC. People would love to be trading their TSMC right now, but they can't. And so I think that's one of the massive benefits of tokenization is you can open up these kind of markets and public equities to global investors and let them trade like around the clock.
You mentioned that it took a little bit longer than maybe a lot of people were expecting. I assume a lot of that just comes down to, again, fears that regulators might have when you do start to open up 24/7 access to markets. I mean, was there anything specifically that you saw that maybe had been solved in the process of, working on it at Bitfinex Securities that you said, hey, look, we're past that now because we solved it?
Yeah, I think one of the fears is around kind of the compliance, the OFAC, the maintaining whitelist, that kind of thing. I think regulators, rightly so, and I think issuers as well, right? They need to know who their shareholders are. They need to make sure that that's properly documented, and they need to make sure that there's controls in places so that your token, your security token, doesn't end up in the hands of someone in Iran or in a sanctioned country or something like that, or for us end up in the hands of a US investor, right? So we need to have those walls in place.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we've used the Liquid network for a lot of our issuances. Number one, it's building on top of Bitcoin, which we like. That's on brand for El Salvador, Bitcoin country. And then number two, it's got this really robust whitelisting functionality, so that once you're on the whitelist, you can do things like pull your assets, pull your securities off the platform.
Yeah.
You can self-custody them. You can even trade them peer-to-peer. So one of the first issuances that we had on the platform was the Blockstream mining note issued by Blackstream. It was kind of a tokenized hash rate contract. It had an ISIN, so it's a security. But people were trading it peer-to-peer within a Telegram chat, which I think is really innovative.
Well, I think it's interesting to see, the BlackRocks of the world and their Build Fund, what they're trying to do there, and the idea of all these major financial institutions now looking at this for the same reason, but also needing to check the boxes. I mean, as that happens, as the traditional finance world continues to lean into tokenization, how does that maybe change your guys' strategy for what you might be looking to do?
Yeah, I think our focus is a little bit different from them. So I've noticed for a long time that there's a real geographic difference between how things like Bitcoin and Tether are both perceived and used. So I think in kind of the G7, the major economies, Bitcoin is basically a speculative asset, and then maybe to some degree an inflation hedge. In a lot of other parts of the world, it's used for remittances, it's used for payments, it's used for savings, and it really is used as an inflation hedge. And Tether even more so. So I think the strategy on the security side is to really focus on those kind of jurisdictions, places where the technology behind Bitcoin can really help them upgrade their capital markets infrastructure and bridge the gap between issuers and investors.
What's interesting too is, we were talking to a Bitcoin layer 2 and the problems they run into when it comes to maybe convincing Bitcoiners to do things with their Bitcoin.
Yeah.
I feel like for the word security, at least for those in crypto in the US, has become kind of like a label they don't want assigned to those tokens in particular.
Sure.
Is it always maybe tricky to, I guess, inform people of the benefits of going the securitized route in
Yeah,
crypto?
no, I think you look back to 2017, kind of the 2018 ICO boom, and I think that was a really interesting proof of concept. But what was missing there, like clearly in hindsight, was clearly defined issuer obligations and investor rights. And I think that's the big difference between STOs and everything else, is that you have a regulator, you've got a framework, and everybody knows the rules of the game and they're clearly defined. And I think that's kind of the big difference.
Yeah, and in helping, I think, not just the people who are investing, but also the companies and the
Sure.
issuers who are trying to figure out
That's right.
what exactly are we signing ourselves up for.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, how much more of that do you think, now that you've solved those things? What are your expectations in terms of sizing the market opportunity here and what you guys want to get done this year, next year, how much, how quickly this can grow?
Yeah, so we had a pretty big issuance in the end of last year, in the fourth quarter of last year. So we had our first tokenized UST bill issued on the platform. I think the first one globally to be done on Bitcoin-based technology. That was done out of here in El Salvador, and that let investors buy these T-bills through a regulated platform with oversight from the regulator here in El Salvador for as low as $1.
Yeah.
Right, and we've got ongoing subscriptions for that where people can come in. You can also trade it in secondary markets. So I think that was a pretty interesting product. We've got more products like that in the pipeline, more different funds. We want to do tokenized public equity. And then we have some very large projects from governments around the region, because it's not just the mainstream institutionals, the big investment banks that are looking at this. It's governments that are looking at this as well. And I think just as last year was the year of the ETF and that pulled in all the institutional money and legitimized it, I think what's happening in the US, if the US does go with a digital asset stockpile, I think that'll really kind of reframe the narrative and everybody will look at it again. And the upside for both security tokens and Bitcoin it's almost unquantifiable.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you had to put a number on it, I think that's kind of always a big wake-up call to people, right? In crypto, you might look at it and say like, okay, back up to a $3 trillion market cap. as a whole, including Bitcoin and everything else. But then you look at the size of the treasury market, and access to U.S. Treasuries, it's insane. And so like when you kind of market size that.
Yeah, I mean, that's how, if you look at security tokens and RWA, it's a really, really big number, right? It's like global public equity, global private equity, global real estate, alternative investments, assets, all of that added up, and then whatever you think the market share of STOs could be. And it's just like a really, really huge number. So it's a huge opportunity. And I think El Salvador is really, really interesting because out of all of the countries globally looking at Bitcoin, looking at stablecoins, looking at crypto, I think they've uniquely nailed like the really accretive parts of the industry, and it's not meme coins, right? It's kind of like Bitcoin, stablecoins, and then tokenized capital markets.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that too, because we are in El Salvador, and the idea of why the country is experimenting with some of these things and the real opportunity. It does seem that, if you do nail all those pieces, with the IMF deal and the changes now and making Bitcoin payments optional, that there is a bit of a shift in the direction of, all right, there might be a larger opportunity here, not just with Bitcoin, but with everything else we might want to do. Talk to me about that in the inner workings of like Bukele trying to figure out what's right.
Yeah, I think that's, everybody, all the companies within the space, we're constantly trying to kind of navigate, within the guardrails and the confines of the traditional system, and that's just the reality of when the rubber hits the road. I think in terms of what I understand of the Bitcoin policy, it hasn't really changed how Bitcoin is used here on the ground. And I think from a digital assets framework perspective, it doesn't impact us at all. Our commitment is to bridge the gap between issuers and investors and bring more money into El Salvador, and to really show people how this technology can be used to grow an economy. And then our commitment is to also do that as much as possible on Bitcoin-based technology.
The way that we like to wrap with these two is kind of your big, bold prediction. We always talk to a lot of people who are deep in the sauce, who know what's going on, who are really smart. And for you, Jesse, I mean, when you look at maybe some things that people might be missing when it comes to securitizing these things on the blockchain and doing it here in El Salvador, what's your big, bold prediction for maybe something people can't even fathom right now?
I don't know about predictions, but my hope is that we see at least one, maybe more large sovereign issuances coming out of the region. I think there's a good chance that could happen this year. Yeah, and I think the size of the issuances, most of the issuances we've done to date have been small. They've been low double-digit million, kind of like $10 million range. I think we're going to add a zero to that, and we're going to see a lot more larger issuances going forward.
Well, it's exciting, and as I said at the beginning, you guys kind of on the forefront of things out here in El Salvador.
Always.
So
Tip of the spear.
Congratulations on everything.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.